Rooting out corruption means more cases in Michigan than anywhere else. U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider is here to talk about it. And with political passion seemingly at an all-time high, how do you plan to be more civil? Today is Sunday, July 7th, 2019, and this is Flashpoint.
Hi, welcome to Flashpoint. I do hope you have enjoyed the Independence Day holiday. Maybe you've even been lucky enough to have a nice long weekend with it. Good to have you with us this morning. It was another week of a lot of back and forth on politics, much of it batted around by people who really aren't all that interested in what those on the other side have to say. We have talked about it a ton on this program, that we are increasingly trapped in our own silos of thought and political persuasion, and that doesn't seem to me to be particularly healthy or the hallmark of a vibrant democracy. But it's not just that people disagree with one another, it's the stridency, the breakdown of civility that comes with it. Well, two people who are very familiar to the Flashpoint family are trying to lead a new path on civility. I imagine Nolan Fenley and Stephen Henderson could find a way to argue about what the D stands for on the Tigers' hats, but they do generally disagree quite agreeably, and they're going to be here a little later on this morning to talk about that. But up first, I've been eager to have U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider in the studio since a conversation I had with him back in May on Mackinac Island. I knew there were quite a few public corruption cases in Michigan. You do too. I did not fully appreciate how unusual it is. We have far and away the most corruption investigations of any state in the country. What is that about? Matthew Schneider's up first today on Flashpoint. For weeks now, I've been turning over in my head a conversation with Matthew Schneider at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island about corruption. Every state investigates corruption. Most states, maybe one a year, some 3 or 4 cases that they might be investigating at a time. State of Michigan has averaged 18 cases a year for the last 5 years. What is that about? Well, U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider is here for us to talk more about it.
Thank you,
Good
Devin.
to have you. Thank you for coming here. And
My pleasure.
I've been thinking about this a lot since our conversation. And the question that I know that you get, some people have written about it this way: if we have the most corruption cases going, it must be because we're the most corrupt state. But
well,
not really, right?
That's not necessarily true. So it is a fact, as you indicated, that we have by far and away more corruption cases here in Michigan, 18 a year per year for the last 5 years. The other states have nowhere near that. However, we also lead the nation in investigating crimes against children and sex trafficking. We lead the nation in healthcare fraud prosecutions and convictions. That's not because we have more corrupt doctors here, more people who are being harmful toward children here. It is because the FBI and the joint task forces that we have working with our office, working with the state and local police officers, have really focused on this ever since the George W. Bush administration. And that also applies to corruption cases.
So clearly there's an aggressive stance here. It's interesting. This doesn't, when I say the last 5 years, 18 a year, that doesn't even take us back to the Kwame Kilpatrick era. It doesn't even include that.
Certainly, and it doesn't take us back to some of the darker days in Michigan's history. For example, in the late 1940s, there were tremendous corruption cases here, and that was really systemic corruption. In 1940, the mayor of Detroit, the county prosecutor, the county sheriff, the police chief, about 80 police officers, they were all indicted for bribery and went to prison. That is systemic, large-spread corruption. We don't have that here in Michigan. We don't have that where everyone is in it together. We have a couple one-hits every once in a while. We'll have a pocket in Macomb County. We've got a pocket in Oakland, right? And we've got pockets in Wayne. But it's certainly not that same size of corruption.
But I think some would argue that it must be systemic and cultural in a way, because as I said to you in our conversation up there, I don't think corrupt people look in the mirror and see a corrupt person looking back at them necessarily. They see somebody who's doing it the way it's always been done, or that everybody does this. Is that generally what we find?
And when you see somebody who takes a bribe and they get away with it, then it inspires other people to think that they might do it as well, which is really exactly the opposite of what we want in Michigan. We want people to learn from those mistakes. Unfortunately, maybe we need to have more people who are convicted before that happens.
Some of these cases that have gotten a lot of attention are, we're talking about a lot of money. We've seen things with everything from towing contracts to trash hauling contracts and deals. Some of these, though, are breathtakingly not worth it, right? You're seeing people that have been on the take for really not worth throwing your career away.
It's really sad if you think about it. I have seen in my career, in my office now, we've seen bribe amounts of $200, $500. Now, why would you throw away your life, throw away your entire career and go to federal prison for such a piddling amount?
Yeah.
You shouldn't do it for a larger amount either, granted.
Sure.
But for some reason, we have seen a decrease in the amount of bribes occasionally. So
I always liken federal investigators. The FBI, of course, is famous for saying we'll neither confirm nor deny. You all are like ducks. You're moving very peacefully on the surface, but underneath there's a lot churning.
Yes.
So of all the things that, clearly we have some cases that we've talked a lot on our news broadcast, especially about what's been going on in Macomb County. How much is going on that we don't know and what's to come?
Well, the investigations are ongoing, so we are not finished with the corruption investigations. I can tell you that years ago in the Kwame Kilpatrick investigation, when that was coming to a close, somebody said that the era of public corruption in this area is over. And that is just not the case. And we are going to continue to fight public corruption. We will do all that we can, use all the resources that we have at our disposal until we finally clean up this region.
What is at the heart of it?
At the heart of it is greed. It is people who are putting their own greedy interests above other folks. And whether that's a towing contract, a contract out at Metro Airport, or something with garbage hauling, whatever, it's people who are forgetting the fact that they were elected by the people. And they serve the people.
The law makes it clear that both are equally lawbreakers, but I'm curious from where you sit. Do you find more fault in the person offering the bribe or the person accepting the bribe?
I see those as both part of the problem. They are both illegal acts. Yeah. They're both federally unlawful and unlawful in the state system. So neither one of those should take place, but unfortunately it does.
It's fascinating. I want to move to a couple other things that you're working on. You're spending a lot of time thinking about China.
I am.
The reason that you were on Mackinac Island, unusual maybe for a U.S. attorney to show up at an event like that, was you were trying to impress upon the business and political leaders there of the cybersecurity and problems and worries that we have. And I think, we all know that that's a problem. You're seeing it in a completely new and more dangerous way right now.
Yes, and it's very eye-opening. All across the country, in all 50 states, there is some aspect of an espionage or investigation related to the Chinese national government, the communist government. And what we're seeing is government-sponsored people are coming into the state of Michigan, and they are infiltrating businesses, and they are stealing their software, stealing their property. Even for agriculture, they're stealing seeds and taking those seeds and bringing them back to China to grow, and then they can just cut people out in Michigan of the market. And then the Michigan farmer is out of luck because he can no longer sell those seeds.
And some of this isn't just trying to steal information. Some of this is creating mayhem with information. You explained to me this one case of a business that had their computers hacked, and rather than just getting information, they were putting information in.
Yes, so it was reported that a Chinese entity had infiltrated this business regarding their sales data, their sales figure. So the company then looks at their sales spreadsheet, and the sales spreadsheet says, well, we're not selling enough to China. We need to sell more. Well, that's all fake, right? Because the numbers are manipulated. So it's tricking the company into thinking we need to take our product and sell more to China, which is a form of economic espionage.
That's pretty wild.
Yes.
Are we always joke that the bad guys, when it comes to high tech, are always a step ahead of your antivirus software, the people that are trying to protect me, that they're always just one hack ahead of me. Is that still the case, largely?
So sometimes that's the case in whether it's espionage, whether it's drug trafficking, whether it's exploitation of children. We are always working harder to catch criminals. And as technology evolves, which it is evolving, so are criminals, and they're using different platforms, such as encrypted devices, and we're working harder to make sure that we can break through those devices.
And in this case, we see that criminals are actually governments. That's what we certainly believe happened in the 2016 election. Are we ready for the 2020 election, given what we know and what we don't know about what happened the last time around?
Well, we are in a much better place right now coming into this election because we are aware of what has happened in the past. So now we are putting together a working group to make sure that will be ready more in the future. And all of the county clerks in the state of Michigan who are primarily responsible for election security with the Secretary of State, they're all on notice that this has happened. So we will work with them and the FBI. We're all going to be working together to make sure that we are cooperating, we are talking, and we are tracking down these leads whenever possible.
That's the lock and key part of data.
Yes.
Have you got an answer for what we do about all these fake stories that are planted all over social media that just whip up people into a political frenzy over something that isn't even true?
So I always tell people, if you see something that's fake, then it's your obligation to call it out. And, you know, if you see, it's just like reporting a crime. If you see something that's a crime, you should say something about it. If you see something, say something. Yeah. You know, it's been said in our democracy or our republic that the answer to incorrect speech is more speech.
Correct.
And that's how we
correct
have to
speech.
correct
Yes,
speech,
right,
and that's how we have to fight our battles.
The last thing I wanted to talk to you, and this is another part of China that you've been studying. We are a border state. You spend a lot of time talking about border issues.
I do.
But you also you were just in Washington talking about the border issues at the other end, and we're seeing really interesting things happen along the Mexican border that I'm not sure have been fully reported or even yet understood. What
yes.
are you seeing?
So we're in a border state here in Michigan. So of course we have a lot to be concerned about trafficking of guns, drugs, and human beings as well.
Yeah.
And so I've been having a lot of conversations with my friends on the southern border in law enforcement. And what I'm learning about that border is, of course, it's very porous and people are coming in. Most of the people want to get caught. They actually want to get caught.
Put in the asylum system.
Exactly, to go on the process. And certainly a lot of people are coming in from Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. But we're also seeing now that people are coming in from Africa. And more recently, we've had an increase in Chinese folks coming across the border into Mexico. And now this should alarm all of us about why do we have, especially what we're talking about with national security, why do we have folks from all the way across the world coming across the southern border? And you might ask a person, you know, well, what is your occupation? And they'll say, I'm a farmer. And of course, their hands are very, very clean and neat. And farming is probably not their background.
Don't look like they've done much rough work on the fields.
Right,
okay?
Exactly. And then you might ask one of the Chinese nationals coming across the southern border, well, what is your education level? I have a PhD. Well, there's not a lot of people farming in China with PhDs. Yeah. So something is going on there, and we need to continue to stay alert to that.
Do you think we have an idea of what that is?
We have certain ideas of what's going on, and I can tell you that we're pretty on top of this in the federal government, but it's more of a larger aspect of the borders in the United States. It's not just people coming across in the southern border. We also have people coming across in the north, and it's not just people from South America. It's from all over the world, really is.
Well, and your sex trafficking focus alone, which is also the heaviest in the country right now, is something we need to have an entire, complete conversation on that, and we'll do that again next time you come and spend time with us. Thanks, Matthew. It's always good to talk.
Thank you, Devin.
U.S. Attorney Matthew Schneider. We'll talk about political civility. Contradiction in terms? We'll see. Next on Flashpoint.
More than 2.5 million Americans are addicted to opiates. The addiction is usually developed through gateway drugs, like prescription painkillers. Using any prescribed medication in ways or amounts not intended by a doctor is just as dangerous as using illicit drugs. If you or someone you know is struggling with addiction, and for more information on prevention, treatment, and recovery services, give the Detroit Wayne Mental Health Authority a call. 800-241-4949. Here to talk, here to help.
It's our biggest 4th of July sale ever at Art Van Furniture and Mattress. Save up to $1,200 on top name brand mattresses. Get 0% for up to 72 months with our new Art Vantage Reward Card. Plus, free same-day delivery, free power base upgrades, free TVs, free sleep bundles, Tempur-Pedic as low as $28 a month, Sealy Serta Beauty Rest as low as $198. Find your better sleep for less at Art Van Furniture and Mattress and all Pure Sleep stores.
DTE Energy wants to help you build Michigan's future. Whether your business is large, small, or in between, a DTE expert can partner with you to suggest new technologies and incentives to help you save money. Money you can use to create jobs and invest in the future. Because when your business thrives, Michigan does too. DTE Energy.
Tonight at 11, they were looking for a miracle.
How do you turn the hero that wants to save your life down? You don't.
See how a Facebook post inspired a Ford worker to save a GM worker's life, giving new meaning to the term United Auto Workers.
In my heart, I knew I was his match.
Find out how a virtual stranger went above and beyond to help a fellow auto worker and how he hopes his decision can encourage others.
We got our miracle.
Tonight on Local 4 News at 11.
Well, my next two guests are very familiar to everybody in the Flashpoint family, and some people, I suppose, over the years would think, well, that I have Nolan Finley and Stephen Henderson on because they can find a way to disagree over just about everything. But I also think it has to do with the fact that they disagree quite agreeably. And I'm very happy to have them here because they're both now heading up the Civility Project. Yes. You two are a really interesting couple, and I say that because you kind of are a couple. You go a lot of places together. People see you at events together, and you're, of course, you sit here together a lot as well, and on Detroit Public Television. But it's really interesting, Stephen, because I've heard you guys argue about the smallest, silliest things. You really can find an argument in anything.
Yeah.
And yet it's civil somehow.
Yeah, it's civil in the sense that I think when each of us walks away from the conversation, no one's saying, well, that's it. I'm never talking to that guy again, or I can't wait
I've
to...
had moments like that with both of you, but you haven't with each other.
And that is about, a mutual respect for the people that we are, as opposed to the things that we might believe or the opinions we might espouse. And that's a really difficult place to get to. I get that. And right now, you think of all the people who can't manage to do it at all, and I completely understand. I think what Nolan and I have been able to do is two things. One is to keep looking beyond just the opinion and look to the person, the man that each of us is, but also understanding where it all comes from, why he thinks what he thinks, and respecting that that he comes from a place that gives meaning to what he's saying, and it's not just pejorative, it's not just nasty, it really is about who he is. Again, that's really hard, and there's times when I want to punch him or run at him or whatever, but we both have worked hard enough at it over 10 years or so to be able to keep it going.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, you've not met probably two people who enjoy disagreeing more than the two of us.
That's part of it.
And let's be honest. A good argument that at the end of it, not going to do any damage to a relationship, so you feel comfortable arguing, you feel comfortable getting heated, you feel comfortable disagreeing. That's a lot of fun, you know?
Yes.
And you can't do that with everybody because people say, oh,
you both give each other a fair amount of space to, I don't feel like you beat each other up over something. Well, you remember when you said 2 years ago, blah, blah, blah.
We're not trying to score points.
But I also think that a key to this, and this is why I wonder how transferable it is, you both sense in each other, I believe, an intellectual equal. And I think a lot of the discourse that happens in America right now is, well, that person doesn't know as much as I do, or that person's not as smart as me. So I guess that's what I'm wondering. You guys took on this project, and I'm wondering how transferable you think what you do is.
Very much, because I think that's the first step. You got to get over this notion that everybody who doesn't think the way you think is somehow stupid or evil or has an ill motive. And one of the first things we did before we ever started arguing was get to know each other and realize that, you know, Steve, very early on, I mean, I respected his work, and I realized he looks at things the same way I do, you know, honestly, assessing the facts, and then applying his own sets of values and experience to it the same way I do it. His experiences and values are different, so he comes up with a different opinion than I do. But we go through the same process. We just end up in different places, which doesn't make either one of us a bad person.
And when you think about the things that are going on right now, I mean, there is real evil in the world, right? And there's real evil in this country that's rearing its head. And I think what we're talking about is not backing away from calling that out or saying that there are times when you've got to stiffen your spine and you know, get after things that are just wrong. At the same time, when you're sitting across the table from somebody that you know, from somebody who lives in your community and is working in the same space as you are, really on the same problems, I think you have to approach it a little differently, and you have to say, what is it about this person that I can find value in order to keep, because that's the only way we solve problems, especially at the local level. And that's what we're really talking about here, how we deal with each other in a really confined space.
Exactly. So many of the disagreements that we hear, particularly if we're watching cable news these days, are really among people who don't necessarily know each other that well.
That's right. That's true.
You two have a different sort of experience there. But I also wonder this, Nolan. You've never been a full-throated endorser of the president. And the paper, of course, very memorably refused to endorse him and endorsed a libertarian candidate instead. And I wonder, Stephen, if he was more of an ardent Donald Trump supporter, if your patience and tolerance would be the same.
It would have been strained, there's no question. You know, I mean, I have a hard time with people who support the president, but I also have learned, and I got to say, since 2016, to be more patient with them. I mean, I spent a lot more time in Macomb County than I did before the election, trying to really understand what it is about somebody who's so vile, from my point of view, that other people find supportable. And that's not, again, that's not easy. And and it's not calling on people to not call out the stuff that he does that's evil and wrong. It is saying, when you're talking about your neighbors, when you're talking about people in your community, you have to find a way, I think, to be able to at least respect the point of view that they have, but
that's why I wanted to throw the president into this, Nolan, because we know that there are families that have a hard time sitting down to Thanksgiving dinner right now over their disagreement about the president.
And they do, because they approach a conversation, and you know, and I'll step back and say, it perhaps is easier because neither one of us are hard partisans. I respected Steve early on for being willing to call out Democrats and liberals. I've always been willing to call out Republicans and conservatives. So we're not so blindly loyal to party or philosophy that we don't recognize flaws. But I think anybody can come to the point where they're willing to listen instead of just talk. And I think I've always enjoyed listening to Steve, and I always learned something. Now, he rarely changes my mind, and I probably never change his. But
we should have had you both come with examples.
But we learned something in the conversation. I believe talking to him and hearing him out helps me make my arguments sharper, and maybe think of things I hadn't thought about in shaping that argument. So, you know, I think we make each other better because we disagree. And I think if people were willing to sit down and understand, you know, folks aren't coming to their positions, whether it's on the president or anything else, out of, you know, just, you know, complete ignorance or evil. They've thought about this. So try to figure out how that process worked for them.
And that's where we've arrived, Stephen, is where this is very, I can't imagine I can't think of another example. The president's supporters find it impossible to find, many of them, I shouldn't say everybody, find it impossible to find any fault with him. Many of his critics find it impossible to find that he's done anything at all of value.
Yeah.
Neither one of those can be right.
Right, but at the same time, I believe that that's what the president is cultivating, right? He's cultivating loyalists and enemies, and the people who are unable to see beyond that, I think, are all playing into his strategy.
But somebody can only divide you if you let him. And one of the things I've always said about the people who have lost their minds over Trump, I mean, you criticize him and then you mimic him.
I appreciate it, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks
for being a part of the Flashpoint family. We'll wrap things up right after this.